Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. In the fall of 1998, Sarah, a young woman who had just graduated from college, unexpectedly received news that she had inherited a dilapidated farmhouse in rural Ohio from a distant relative she had never met. Although she knew that the house had been abandoned for many years and that there were bad rumors about it, Sarah decided to move in. She hoped that a fresh start in a quiet place would help her regain balance in her life after recent events. When Sarah arrived, she realized that the house was even more dilapidated than she had imagined. The wooden walls were rotten, the windows were broken, and the roof was covered in moss. The surrounding grounds were overgrown with weeds, creating a desolate and lonely look. However, Sarah still felt a strange attraction to this place. She began to clean and repair the damage, trying to turn this old house into a real home. From the very first days, Sarah noticed something strange. Even though the weather outside was quite calm, there was always a cold wind blowing through the cracks of the house, carrying strange sounds. It was not the usual whistling sound of the wind, but very small whispers, as if someone was talking softly somewhere nearby. Sarah tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an illusion created by the old house. But the strange phenomena did not stop there. Sarah began to smell the smell of rotten food in the air. Even though she had cleaned very carefully and there was no leftover food in the house, sometimes she felt like someone was watching her, a creepy feeling that made her turn her head to look back. One evening, while Sarah was reading by the fire, she suddenly heard the whispers she had heard before more clearly. This time, they were no longer vague, but clearer, as if there were many voices speaking at the same time. But all of them were very weak and sad. Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. Her heart began to beat faster. She tried to listen, wanting to understand what those voices were saying, but they were too small and mixed together. Only the sounds of lamentation and soft moans reached her ears. Sarah felt a sadness invade her soul, as if she were feeling the suffering of the people who had lived here. That night, Sarah tossed and turned, unable to sleep. She kept listening to the whispers in the wind, trying to figure out what they meant. Suddenly, a clearer voice rang out, like a sigh of despair. "So hungry." Sarah jumped up, sitting up straight in bed. She looked around the dark room, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Only the wind was still whispering outside the window, carrying the mournful cries of hungry souls. Sarah knew that she was not alone in this house. She had awakened something terrifying, and the peaceful life she had hoped for had vanished like smoke. After that night, Sarah no longer dared to sleep peacefully. She always felt an invisible presence surrounding her, and the whispers in the wind seemed to never stop. They crept into every corner of the house, sometimes sounding like a child sobbing, sometimes like a mother's choked pleas. Sarah began searching everywhere in the house, trying to determine where those sounds were coming from. She checked every room, every corner, but found no sign of anyone living there. The doors and windows were all closed, and there was no source of air that could have produced those strange whispers. Fear gradually gave way to curiosity. Sarah decided to learn about the history of this house, hoping to solve the supernatural phenomena she was experiencing. She went to the local library and searched for old documents about this land. After many hours of research, she found an old newspaper article about a family who had lived on this farm in the 1930s. The article tells of the Miller family, a young couple with 3 small children. They had lived through the difficult years of the Great Depression and were reduced to extreme poverty. A harsh winter, a flu epidemic, had claimed the lives of the entire family. It was rumored that they had died of hunger and despair. Sarah felt a choking sadness as she read this. The whispers in the wind, the mournful wails she heard were probably the spirits of the Miller family, still haunted by the terrible hunger they had endured. In the days that followed, the strange phenomena in the house became more and more obvious and frightening. Sarah began to see shadows moving through the hallways. Sometimes, she even heard light footsteps upstairs. When she was downstairs, the smell of rotten food also appeared more frequently, so strong that it was unbearable. One evening, while Sarah was cooking in the kitchen, she suddenly heard a child sobbing behind her. She turned around, startled, but saw no one. Only the pots on the stove were shaking slightly and unusually. "Mommy, I'm so hungry." A weak child's voice rang out, sounding like it was coming from nowhere. Sarah stood there, her hand holding the spoon trembling. She knew that she could no longer ignore what was happening. The spirits of the Miller family were trying to contact her, and they were begging for help. That night, Sarah decided to try to communicate with them. She sat in the middle of the living room, where she usually heard the whispers most clearly, and said softly, "Hello everyone. I know you're here. Is there anything I can do for you?" There was a long silence. Then the whispers came again, this time clearer and seemingly answering her. "Hungry. Cold. Please. Some food." A female voice choked up, as if trying to speak in pain. Sarah felt her heart constrict. She couldn't imagine what the Millers had been through. She was determined to help them find peace, no matter how scary it was. "I will help you," Sarah said, her voice determined. "I will bring you food. Please rest assured." As soon as Sarah finished speaking, a chill filled the room. The candles on the table swayed slightly, and the whispers in the wind seemed to soften a little. Sarah felt a slight change in the air, as if the spirits were listening and hoping. She knew that the journey ahead would be filled with hardships and challenges. But she was no longer afraid. Instead, a strong determination welled up in her heart, a sincere desire to help the poor souls trapped in this house. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a new determination. She went to the kitchen and began preparing a hearty meal. She made hot chicken soup, baked a loaf of fragrant bread, and prepared a plate of fresh fruit. She remembered what she had read about the Miller family and tried to imagine the foods they might have enjoyed. When the meal was ready, Sarah carefully laid it out on the old dining room table. She placed a bowl of steaming soup, a few slices of golden toast, and a plate of red apples. She whispered, "Here's some food for everyone. Hope you like it." Then Sarah stepped back and watched. Nothing happened right away. The room was still silent, with only the weak morning sunlight filtering through the broken windows. Sarah felt a little disappointed, but she decided to be patient. She left the living room and went upstairs. When she returned about an hour later, Sarah was surprised to find that the dishes on the table were gone. There was no trace of them, as if they had vanished into thin air. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but at the same time, she felt a strange joy, as if the spirits had accepted her gift. That night, the whispers in the wind became clearer. Sarah could hear faint words of thanks and sighs of satisfaction. She felt a little warmth spread in her heart, as if she had done something good. However, in the following days, the presence of the Miller family became more and more obvious. Sarah began to see shadows moving around the house during the day. Not just at night. Sometimes, she even caught a glimpse of a thin woman holding 3 small children tightly. their faces pale and haggard. The smell of rotten food also became stronger, permeating the entire house. Sarah tried to clean and ventilate, but the stench still did not go away. She began to feel short of breath and nauseous. One evening, while Sarah was watching TV, she suddenly heard a child sobbing right next to her. She turned around in surprise and saw a small figure standing in the corner of the room. Her tiny face contorted in pain. The figure was blurry, but Sarah could clearly see the child's big, teary eyes. "I'm hungry. Mommy, I'm so hungry," the child whispered, her voice heartbreaking. Sarah couldn't hold it in any longer. She burst into tears, ran to the figure and tried to hug it, but her hands only touched cold air. The child's pain and despair seemed to be transmitted straight to her heart. From that night on, the wailing and moaning in the house became more frequent and more intense. Sarah couldn't sleep, always being awakened by sobs and weak pleas. She felt like she was living in the midst of a family writhing in hunger. And she was completely helpless. One night, Sarah dreamed that she was in a dark and cold kitchen. The Miller family appeared before her, their faces pale and frighteningly thin. Their eyes were sunken, looking at her with a desperate, pleading look. "Please, help us," the mother whispered, her voice weak as if about to disappear. "We're so hungry, starving to death." The children were sobbing too, their cries choked and painful. Sarah felt a terrible haunting overtake her. She knew that the Millers' hunger was not just physical, but also spiritual, a hunger to be freed from the pain and haunting of the past. She had to find a way to help them, even if it meant facing the most terrifying things. After a haunting dream about the Millers, Sarah knew she couldn't simply feed them. Their hunger wasn't just physical, but a yearning for freedom from the tragedies and pains of their past. Sarah decided to dig deeper into the Millers' story, hoping to help them find some final peace. The next morning, Sarah drove to the nearest town and visited the local historical society. The elderly librarian, with thick glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, helped Sarah find old records about the Millers. Sarah learns that John and Martha Miller and their 3 young children lived on the farm in the 1930s. They were poor farmers, and the Great Depression had taken everything from them. Sarah reads Martha's heartbreaking diary entries, describing the hard days when they had to eat the little they had left and watching their children grow thinner and thinner from hunger. The scribbled, tear-stained notes tug at Sarah's heart. She feels the desperation and the heartache of a mother who cannot provide for her children. In the diary, Martha also mentions a failed harvest and a large debt they cannot pay. There was a haunting passage. "We have nothing left to eat. John has gone to town to find work, but there is still no news. My children are crying for food. My heart feels like someone is squeezing it." The last lines of the diary become disjointed and confusing, then end abruptly. Sarah feels a sense of unease as she reads this. She suspects that the Millers' deaths were not simply due to disease and starvation. Sarah continues to search through old local newspapers. Finally, she finds a short article about the Millers' deaths. The article says that they were found dead in their house on a cold winter morning. The cause of death is said to be carbon monoxide poisoning from a broken furnace. However, Sarah feels that something is wrong. Why would Martha write about starvation in her diary, when the cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning? She suspected that some dark secret was being hidden. When Sarah returned to the farm, the strange phenomena in the house became more intense. The whispers in the wind were no longer just faint cries, but became painful moans and desperate cries for help. Sarah also heard heavy footsteps upstairs and the sound of furniture being knocked over. One night, while Sarah was sleeping, she was awakened by a loud noise coming from the kitchen. She rushed downstairs and was horrified to see the kitchen cabinets wide open. The dishes smashed on the floor, and the walls torn as if a ferocious animal had attacked the place. The smell of rotting food became so strong that Sarah found it difficult to breathe. She saw on the old dining table the dishes she had prepared for the Miller family the night before were scattered everywhere, as if someone had angrily thrown them over. Sarah felt a terrible fear come over her. She realized that these souls were not simply hungry, but also carried a terrible resentment and anger. Perhaps their deaths were not an accident, but some kind of terrible incident. Suddenly, Sarah heard the sound of children sobbing right next to her. She turned around and saw 3 blurry figures of the Miller children standing in the corner of the room, their eyes red from crying. They looked at Sarah with resentment and despair. You didn't help us," one of the children whispered, her voice filled with pain. "We're still hungry, so hungry." Sarah felt her heart clench. She knew that she had failed. She tried to help them, but it seemed that it was not enough. Their hunger and suffering were too great, and the darkness that enveloped this house was getting thicker and thicker. Sarah began to doubt whether she could truly help the Miller family find peace, or whether she herself would become the next victim of this terrifying curse. After that terrible night, Sarah knew that she could no longer continue to live in fear and helplessness. She decided to find the truth behind the Miller family's deaths, no matter how dangerous it was. She believed that only when the truth was revealed could these tormented souls find peace. The next morning, Sarah returned to the local historical society. She searched more thoroughly through the old records and finally found a small newspaper clipping from the 1930s. Not mentioned in the previous article, the story tells of a police investigation into the deaths of the Miller family, which suspected that it was not a simple case of coal gas poisoning. According to the story, a neighbor reported seeing a strange man leaving the Miller family farm on the night of their deaths. However, the investigation went nowhere and was eventually closed. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope in her heart. Perhaps the Miller family had been murdered, and their spirits were still here because of this injustice. She decided to investigate on her own. Sarah began asking the elders in town who might remember the Miller family. After several days of searching, she found an old woman who had been a friend of Martha Miller. The old woman told Sarah about the Miller family's difficult life and about a wealthy farm owner named Silas Blackwood, who had repeatedly threatened them because of a debt they could not pay. The old woman also revealed a shocking detail. Silas Blackwood had once intended to take over the Miller family farm at all costs. Sarah suspected that Blackwood had something to do with their deaths. Returning to the farm, Sarah felt the Miller family's presence stronger than ever. The whispers in the wind now carried anger and resentment. Sarah also heard heavy footsteps in the house and the sound of broken furniture. One night, Sarah dreamed that she was standing in the Millers' living room on that fateful night. She saw Silas Blackwood enter the house, his face fierce and vicious. He shouted and threatened John Miller, demanding that he pay his debt immediately. When John said he had no money, Blackwood became angry and attacked him. Martha tried to protect her husband, but Blackwood pushed her aside. He then locked the windows and doors, and set fire to the broken fireplace, spreading toxic coal smoke throughout the house. The Millers died in despair and pain. Sarah woke up in a panic, cold sweat all over her body. She knew she had discovered the truth. Silas Blackwood was the murderer of the Miller family. With the help of the locals, Sarah gathered enough evidence to reopen the old case. Finally, the truth was revealed, and Silas Blackwood, who had long since passed away, was exposed as the murderer. After justice was served, Sarah returned to the farm. She prepared a last sumptuous meal, placing the Miller family's favorite dishes on the table. She lit candles and whispered, "This is the last meal for everyone. May everyone rest in peace." As Sarah finished speaking, a warm breeze blew through the room, carrying soft and grateful whispers. The blurry figures of the Miller family appeared for a moment, their faces no longer filled with pain, but instead filled with serenity and peace. Then, they slowly disappeared into the air, blending into the gentle breeze. The whispers in the wind gradually died down. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief, as if a burden had been lifted. Since that night, the old farm has not been haunted anymore. Sarah continues to live there, but she never forgets the story of the Miller family. She brought justice to them and helped them find their final rest. And sometimes, on moonlit nights, when the wind blows gently through the trees, Sarah still feels like someone is whispering thanks to her. Whispers as soft as a prayer in the wind. Hopefully this story has brought you moments of suspense and horror. If you like real ghost stories like this, don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next videos. Goodbye and see you again.